Steve, it's all yours. I won't bother introducing you. You can introduce yourself, and by all
Right.
means, take over the
I'm
screen
trying to
share.
get the I'm trying to get the PowerPoint, but I'm having no success. That's strange. I'm clicking on PowerPoint, but I know I haven't. I'm clicking on PowerPoint.
Just right click on the PowerPoint, right click, see if there's anything that comes,
Yes.
and now open it that way, single click. Okay, now we can see it. And now slideshow, that's it.
Right, we got it. Right, the modern slave trade. I'm going to deal with a little bit of history first of all. This picture we took in Zanzibar off the East African coast. Stone Town in Zanzibar was host to one of the world's last open slave markets, presided over by Arab traders until it was shut down by the British in 1873. Little bit of history. Slavery predates both laws and money. It was part of the Nile cultures from 7000 BC, ancient Mesopotamia from 4000 BC, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire up to 1453 AD, and during the Crusades, Genoa, Venice, and Verdun were all major slave markets. The transatlantic slave trade is the one that we mainly familiar with, lasted from 1400s for over 400 years. Millions of slaves were brought from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean. The Oriental slave trade sent slaves from Africa to Asia. Abolition in the United Kingdom. In 1787, the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed by a handful of Quakers and the young Anglican Thomas Clarkson. In 1807, the British slave trade was legally abolished, and by 1833, the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire. This is Baker's Fort in northern Uganda. I think, Janie, you may remember this. We've been shown by our friend Robert what happened there. The slaves were sorted there. Those unfit were slaughtered or thrown to the lions. Those unfit to walk the hundreds of miles to the coast. It's named after Sir Samuel Baker, who had a very unusual history. In 1859, at a slave market in Bulgaria, the explorer Samuel Baker fell in love with a white slave girl destined for the Ottoman Pasha of Vidin. He was outbid by the Pasha, but bribed the girl's attendants, and they ran away in a carriage together, and she eventually became his wife, Florence. She travelled everywhere with him. In 1869, Baker led a military expedition to the equatorial regions of the Nile with the object of suppressing the slave trade. It is said that Queen Victoria was reluctant to meet him because of the unorthodox way in which he met his wife. Abolition in the United States. In 1852, the publication of the anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe sold 500,000 copies. And by 1865, the legal ownership of slaves were abolished in the United States. Whoops. I need to go back. However, thousands of African Americans were caught in peonage, re-enslaved by Southern planters who coerced them into signing contracts as sharecroppers. So although slavery was officially abolished, it still continued in some form. The 20th century. In the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, atrocities by King Leopold. Whole villages were enslaved to collect rubber, and the death toll was estimated at 10 million people. Henry Morton Stanley went out, and I think he must have been implicated in some of the atrocities, which we don't normally associate him with. In World War II, atrocities by the Japanese and others. In the Soviet gulags, 18 million people were arrested for political or religious beliefs. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed by all the members of the United Nations in 1948. But one has to bear in mind that the membership of the United Nations then was only 50, whereas now it's 193. There were quite a few articles within the Declaration of Human Rights. I've just chosen 3. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all its forms. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Everyone has a right to education. Obviously, they're not listening to that in Afghanistan, where most girls are denied an education now. More recent conventions. The Geneva Convention, after the Second World War in 1948, imposed minimum conditions under which prisoners of war may be forced to work during times of armed conflict. 1956, United Nations Supplementary Convention on Slavery prescribed slave-like practices, including bondage, serfdom, forced marriage, and child servitude. And finally, in 1979, the International Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This demanded the suppression of all forms of trafficking in women and the exploitation of prostitution in women. Now, slavery has never stopped, despite numerous laws being passed. A definition of slavery: a relationship in which one person is controlled by another through violence, the threat of violence, or psychological coercion, has lost free will and free movement, is exploited economically, and is paid nothing beyond subsistence. It is estimated that today there are about 49.6 million slaves alive, and that figure was estimated in 2022 by the Walk Free Foundation and the International Labour Organization. In forced labour, 27.6 million. In the private economy, 17.3 million. In commercial sexual exploitation, 6.3, and imposed by state authorities, 4 million. And in forced marriage, they estimate 22 million, of which 40% are children. I think children are classified as those under 18. I'm not quite sure how they estimate their figures, but different websites give a slightly different number, but it's always over 40 million. Roughly 25% of all modern slavery victims are children. The COVID pandemic exacerbated the conditions that lead to modern slavery because those were more vulnerable. Migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to forced labour. The 10 countries with the highest proportion of modern slaves. North Korea, 10% are estimated to be in forced labour, either in farming, construction projects, or road building. And now in recent weeks, 10,000 have been sent to fight in Ukraine. Eritrea, where there is forced conscription. They're mainly working in the mines. And to a lesser extent, Mauritania. I'll mention Mauritania later because that's a special form of slavery that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Saudi Arabia is an interesting one. 20,000 workers died in Saudi Arabia in the last 8 years, mainly working on the line, a megacity at Neom, which is going to be 110 miles long with no cars or roads. They must be living in appalling conditions. Turkey. A lot of human trafficking exists in Turkey. Tajikistan. A lot of cotton picking. United Arab Emirates. A lot of domestic servitude. Russia. Imprisonment against state views. Afghanistan. Probably forced marriage. Human trafficking. Kuwait. In Kuwait, 620,000 domestic migrant workers were working in 90% of Kuwaiti homes in 2018, and the number continues to grow. They're the 10 countries with the highest proportion of modern slaves, but the countries with the highest number of modern slaves, slightly different. India, where it's estimated that 11 million. I'll mention quite a bit about India in a moment. China, where we often read about the forced labour of Tibetans and the Uyghur communities. North Korea, we've mentioned before, about 2.7 million. Pakistan, where people are in bonded labour, forced marriage, child labour. Russia, where forced labour exists for opposing government views. Indonesia, where migrant workers are exploited in the fishing industry. And Nigeria, which is an unusual case, where we have the confinement of girls in baby factories. Trafficked women are often sought after. Those who are pregnant are promised abortions and they are kept and the babies sold. Those who aren't aren't pregnant, are impregnated and kept, and again the babies are sold on for profit. And we often read about the exploitation in the north of Nigeria of girls and women by Boko Haram. The 2014 Global Slavery Index estimated that about 40% of modern slavery is found in India. It's not a country I've been to, but I find it difficult to understand what happens there. The vast majority of victims are Dalits, formerly known as the Untouchables. There are about 300 million Dalits in India. They find access to education, healthcare, and justice restricted or denied. A Dalit is 27 times more likely to be trafficked or forced into bonded labour than anyone else in India. You may have seen the award-winning film Kavi powerfully portrays the situation of Dalit children working as bonded labourers in India's brick kilns. Kavi is a boy who wants to play cricket and go to school, but is forced to work. In 2016, the anti-slavery organisation managed to obtain a release from bondage for many brick kiln workers, despite the state of Punjab still not recognising that bonded labour still exists in the state. So the authorities seem to turn a blind eye to what's going on. This map shows the goods produced by forced labour around the world. I'll just mention a few and summarise. Coffee and cocoa from Nigeria and the Ivory Coast and West Africa here. Sugarcane from the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Bolivia, Pakistan and India. Cattle from Niger, Pakistan, Myanmar, China and North Korea. Bricks from India, Pakistan, Myanmar, China and North Korea. Fireworks from China. Cotton from Benin, and then these countries in South Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, all produce cotton. Textiles and garments from China, Vietnam, Malaysia, North Korea, Ethiopia, India and Thailand. Electronics from China and Malaysia. Carpets from India, Pakistan and Singapore. Tobacco from Malawi. Gold and rare minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo and North Korea. And finally, diamonds from Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sierra Leone. Speaking of which, I took this faded picture in Sierra Leone in 1967 of alluvial diamond mining. They're sieving through gravel in the rivers looking for rough diamonds. I don't think they're necessarily being exploited, but I doubt whether they were paid very much by the local Lebanese diamond traders. Types of modern slavery in the world today, with the exception of forced marriage, forced labour. I'm going to deal with each of these in turn. Forced labour, about 10%. Chattel slavery, very, very few, less than 1%. Debt bondage slavery, 60%, the most common. Contract slavery, about 30%. Forced labour. This is practiced by a government or other official groups or rebel soldiers. In Uzbekistan, each year, over 1 million students, teachers, nurses, doctors, and so on are forced to pick cotton for 3 months. They are paid little or nothing. Those who cannot or will not can buy themselves free for $150. Before we go on to the next one about Uzbekistan, the International Labour Organization have managed to stamp out the use of young children. If the workers say they are forced to work, they will lose their jobs. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, armed gangs force villagers to dig a mineral containing tantalum. Tantalum is sold to exporters in Europe and Asia to be used in mobile phones and computers, so it's quite an important mineral. Eritrea, I've mentioned before, where there's forced conscription, often indefinite, to the mines. The mines are run by Canadian and Australian companies, which I think must turn a blind eye to what's going on. And it probably results in so many Eritreans trying to escape. I'm sure we accommodate quite a few trying to get to our shores. This surprised me. In the United States, it is lawful in many states to make prisoners do forced labor. And bringing it up to date, yesterday in California and Nevada, they voted on an anti-slavery bill that could ban the practice. The results of Nevada are in, they've banned it. But when I checked this morning, the results in California were too close to predict. A lot of the people were complaining they want to complete their degrees rather than go out doing forced labour, fighting fires or repairing cemeteries or working on construction sites. So that was an anti-slavery bill that was voted on yesterday, this week. That's forced labour. Child soldiers. This covers the last 25 years. So you can see the parts of the world that soldiers have been used in some countries around the world in the last 25 years. Of course, it happened in Uganda way back in 2002, 2003, probably Colombia about the same time. But there are still countries that do conscript children under the age of 18 as child soldiers. Chattel slavery is an unusual one. A person is captured, born, or sold into permanent servitude, and ownership is often asserted. It's similar, or very same, to old slavery, because they're born into a household where their parents were slaves. Occurs mainly in Mauritania, Niger, Mali, and Chad, the countries across the equatorial region. It seems to exist on racial lines. The lighter-skinned Berbers enslaved the darker-skinned Mauritanians. In Mauritania, which was the last country to outlaw slavery in 2007, Arab Berbers have owned chattel slaves for generations. They're born into bondage. Slaves and their children are the property of male family members, usually living in their master's house. They are not paid for work. They tend crops and cattle, do domestic chores, and have no freedom of movement. Only one prosecution has been made under Mauritania's anti-slavery laws since it was abolished in 2007. Although the sentences were shorter than the law prescribed, it was highly significant as the slave owners were highly influential and of powerful families. So very uncommon, but it also exists to some extent in India and Nepal, but it's mainly in those 4 countries in West Africa. Debt bondage slavery, the most common. A person pledges him or herself against a loan of money, but the length and the nature of the money is not defined and the labor does not diminish the original debt. The work of the debtor may be applied to the debt, but through a false accounting or extortionate interest, repayment is forever out of reach. Mainly common in Southeast Asia, particularly in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And it usually arises when a crisis occurs, a serious illness or a crop failure. Families are offered a loan. They and all their children are then forced into debt bondage. The debt usually increases as their employer deducts payments for equipment or faulty work. They work in agriculture, brick kilns we've mentioned, rice work, firework production, stone quarries, carpet, embroidery, and garment factories. Just as one example, in India, from the age of 4, Manjula accompanied her mother at 5 o'clock every morning to work in a matchstick factory. They worked in appalling conditions for just a few rupees a day. Every month they saw dozens of their workmates suffer chemical burns and terrible injuries from explosions. So a big problem in India. Contract slavery, 30%. Contracts guarantee employment, perhaps in a workshop, a factory. Can't quite see that. Let me move that picture a bit. That's better. Perhaps in a workshop, factory, or mine, but when the workers arrive, they're enslaved. Most common in Southeast Asia, Brazil, and some Arab states and parts of India and Africa. Many children work as slaves in the cocoa industry in countries like Ghana, often getting injured. They are malnourished and are not allowed to eat the cocoa they are cultivating. May mention that in the Gulf states, there's a prominent kafala system, which has led to harsh punishments and impossible circumstances for many women subjected to domestic work. The kafala system is a visa sponsorship program that has facilitated the import and illegal employment of many migrants in the areas of construction and domestic work. Through recruitment agencies, many individuals sign contracts for various occupations within the Gulf countries and migrate there with the intention of building a new life. Many are immediately put into jobs that do not align with their contracts. Their wages are lowered or withheld, and they are put into debt. Employers have often confiscated migrant workers' passports and mobile phones, rendering them completely vulnerable to the regulations and demands set forth by their employers. In Qatar, construction workers building the 2022 World Cup stadiums were often treated like slaves. The sex trade. The exploitation of women and children within national or across international borders for the purposes of forced sex work. They're taken from poor countries to rich countries. So as an example, in Europe, United Nations ranks high destination countries, Belgium, Germany, Greece, Italy, and Netherlands. You can see them on the sides of the road, even in Italy. High origin countries, Albania, Bulgaria, Moldova, Ukraine, and Romania. And it's estimated that in the 1990s, an estimated 100,000 Albanian girls were trafficked. In Asia and Australasia, the high destination countries are Japan, Thailand, Bahrain, Singapore, and Australia. The high origin countries are India, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Thailand. Domestic servitude. The seemingly normal practice of live-in help that is used as cover for the exploitation and control of someone, usually from another country. Victims may appear to be nannies or servants, but the moment they arrive, their employment arrangement change into situations where they cannot leave on their own free will, and it becomes a case of enslavement. Numbers of child domestics. Indonesia, 700,000. Brazil, 560,000. The Philippines, 300,000. Bangladesh, large numbers again, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. India, millions. Bridal slaves. The one-child family policy in China has led to a gender imbalance, as many female fetuses are aborted. Men have sometimes resorted to purtesan brides kidnapped in other parts of the country or abroad. Traffickers also operate in India to provide brides for clients, either by force or with a promise of a good job. And this next one surprised me a lot. Not where you would expect. In the United States, there is no national ban on child marriage. Only 13 states have laws that outlaw marriage under 18. Almost 300,000 children under 18, some as young as 10 or 12, but mostly aged 16 or 17, were married in the United States between 2001 and 2016, over 80% between an underage girl and an adult man. All that you need is parental support and the nod of a friendly judge for an underage girl to marry. What a country. Child beggar slaves. You may have seen the Oscar-winning film Slumdog Millionaire, highlighted the plight of Indian children who were being forced to beg by mafia-style gangmasters. Hundreds of thousands are trapped in this way. They're often beaten by their guardian when they return with less than 200 rupees, which is about £2 for the day. As an example of a domestic worker, Beatrice Fernando from Sri Lanka. She responded to an advert for work as a housemaid in Lebanon. She left home, intended to send money to her parents and 3-year-old son. At the job agent's office in Beirut, her passport was taken away. She was sold to a wealthy woman who lived in a mansion on the 4th floor of a tower block. She had to work all day, washing, cleaning, scrubbing. She had to scavenge through the waste bin for food. The telephone was locked, so she couldn't call the job agency. The door was locked, so she couldn't escape. The guards were instructed to shoot her if she ever tried to escape. She eventually escaped by jumping from the apartment's 4th floor balcony. She broke her back and is in constant pain. Many of Lebanon's 176,000 migrant workers are living in very poor conditions with very low wages. Some have now been abandoned after residents fled after the recent Israeli bombings in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Human trafficking. Trafficking is the crime of carrying someone into slavery by force or fraud, and is a crime whether or not the person agrees to go with the trafficker. About 800,000 men, women, and children are trafficked each year across borders. Trafficking is the 3rd largest source of income for organised crime after drug smuggling and arms smuggling. Many victims fall prey to trafficking because they're vulnerable and accept false promises of good jobs and higher wages. Supply chain. As an example, in cocoa from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. In the Ivory Coast, there are about 800,000 farms that grow cocoa, producing about half the world's supply. Young men from neighbouring countries like Mali and Burkina Faso arrive looking for work. Some are tricked and enslaved into working on the farms. No one knows how many farms use slaves, but a good estimate is less than 5%, so quite a small amount. The farmers sell their cocoa to wholesalers. The small amount of slave-grown cocoa then gets mixed in with the free cocoa. There is no way of telling them apart. Attempts have been made to eradicate the use of slaves after the Cocoa Protocol was established in 2001. Pilot scheme has been started, but it remains unclear who should fund it. Now we come to the United Kingdom. The UK government estimates that there are 10,000 people living in slavery in Britain today. However, slavery experts quote a much higher number, some as many as 10 times as much. And we are told that slavery is likely to be going on with 10 miles from you. Sobering thought. Sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, cannabis farms, factory work, fruit picking. We've visited fruit pickers in France, in Kent, with Romanian friends there, And we didn't find they were exploited. They were living in caravans and had adequate washing and cooking facilities, but maybe in other places they are exploited more. Car washing, paving dryways, and lastly, nail bars. Factory work. As an example, a young Latvian woman came to London on her own initiative, leaving children behind to make money for her family. She was recruited by an agency and had to pay £100 fee. They moved her to Hull and took her passport, supposedly to send her to the Home Office for registration. 4 months later, she had not received her passport, and of course they had not sent it off. This impacted on her benefit status. She felt she had to stay with the agency to get it back. She regularly worked 16-hour shifts in factories under threat of losing her job and accommodation if she refused. She had to sleep in a car between shifts in Barnsley. Overtime was never paid. Whoops. Skipped a few things by mistake. Spurious deductions for transport costs and admin were the norm, and systematic theft by the deliberate miscalculation of wages. Working 2 shifts, she was often paid for 1. She sometimes had to share a bedroom with 2 men she had not met before. Her protests were met with threats of dismissal. She felt trapped. She had no friends, her English was poor, and she didn't know where to seek help. Traffickers often target soup kitchens. They are taken to banks and building societies to open accounts, with their gang masters as interpreters. Once operating, the accounts are taken over by the gang to launder money. Slaves are often threatened with prostitution, sham weddings, or sale of organs. The Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which was a consolidation of existing slavery and trafficking offences. 2 new civil orders to enable the courts to place restrictions on those convicted of modern slavery offences or those involved in such offences but not yet convicted. The establishment of an independent anti-slavery commissioner to encourage good practice on the prevention of modern slavery offences and the identification of victims, the provision of mechanisms for seizing traffickers' assets and channeling some of the money towards victims for compensation payments. The first commissioner was Kevin Hyland. The creation of a new statutory defence for slavery or trafficking victims compelled to commit criminal offences like beggar slaves. The transparency in the supply chain provisions. This amendment requires businesses to publish an annual statement if they have an annual turnover over 36 million. And of course, that eliminates a lot of smaller firms. The statement must confirm the steps taken to ensure that slavery and human trafficking are not taking place in the business or in the supply chain, or declare that no steps to confirm the existence of slavery or trafficking have been taken. Quite difficult to assess. Implementation of the Act. 289 offences were prosecuted under the Act in 2015 in the first year, and there had been a 40% rise in the number of victims referred for support. In 2016, the Anti-Slavery Commissioner suggested that the number of crimes being reported and investigated under the Act was falling short of the real number of cases. In the same month, Theresa May announced the following addition of measures: the creation of a task force, coordinate government action, a budget of 33.5 million. Prosecutions from the Crown Prosecution Service for human trafficking. They're the figures for the last 5 years. So you can see there's an average of about 250 prosecutions per year, with a success rate of somewhere between 70 and 75%. A few examples now to finish with since the Act was implemented. In May 2016, 4 members of the Connors family were jailed for a total of 27 years for keeping 2 men as slaves. Patrick Joseph Connors, 59, forced Scottish man Michael John Hughes to work for his family business for more than 20 years, paying him for as little as £5 a day for back-breaking work. Jurors were told that Mr. Hughes was beaten all the time if he did not do as he was told, and was made to live in appalling conditions. Another couple ordered to pay compensation to men to work as slaves. In June 2016, a British couple, Darrell Houghton and Jacqueline Judge, were faced with paying a bill of hundreds of thousands of pounds to victims of modern slavery. 6 Lithuanian men were trafficked to the UK and severely exploited by Houghton's company in Kent. They worked frequently on farms owned by leading egg suppliers to major supermarkets, were made to work around the clock, and housed in degrading and inhumane conditions. In 2017, brothers jailed for trafficking sports direct workers. They raked in about £35,000 after bringing 18 vulnerable Polish men in 2015 and 2016 with the promise of a job and a place to live, then taken most of their money and wages. They were both jailed for 6 years. Traveller family, enslaved workers for up to 26 years. This is the 11-strong Rooney clan, forced one of their workers into servitude for a total of 26 years, repairing properties and tarmacking drives, while the family drove high-performance cars and had holidays in Barbados and Australia. A total of 18 men, aged from 18 to 63, many with learning difficulties, disabilities and alcohol and drug problems, worked for the family, living in shabby caravans and stables. They were jailed for a total of 79 years. So the Act is having some effect. Gangs traffic children from Romania to shoplift. This is quite recent. One Romanian girl who was first caught at the age of 12, but by 15 had stolen at least £140,000 worth of goods. Scottish police are extremely concerned about the trafficking of teenage shoplifters who are being robbed of their childhood. This was only a few weeks ago. And there's a lot of shoplifting happening in England recently as well. We don't know whether the gangs sending children in or not, but that's quite recent. Very recent one. A few weeks ago, Barbie factory workers in China suffering for 2p per doll. Workers toil with blistered hands and burnt skin to churn out hundreds of Barbie dolls by the end of the day, £1.50 per hour, and are forced to work hundreds of hours of overtime. So, to finish, it's up to you. When you go shopping, who made the product? Who is serving you? Who is cleaning your car? Who is doing your nails? Who is paving your drive? Do you want to live in a world still built on the back of slavery? And to finish, the last slide, we know that Faringdon is a fair trade town. Fair trade is a trading partnership based on dialogue, transparency, and respect that seeks greater equity in international trade. It contributes to sustainable development by offering better trading conditions to and securing the rights of marginalised producers and workers, especially in the South. I'm not sure about the South. It should really be the South and the East. And apparently, there are 2,029 fair trade towns in the world, over 6 continents, with 5 in Africa, 2 in Ghana, 2 in Cameroon, and 1 in South Africa. And that's it, I'm afraid. Rather depressing news. I'll try and answer any questions, but it may be the limit of my research that I've touched on.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. If you unshare, then we can see everyone. Or I can unshare for you if you want.
Don't want to log out by mistake.
You just need to click on the share button and then unshare. If you could. Can you see the green share button?
No.
At the bottom. Well, okay, I'll take over and then I'll unshare. And now I'll stop sharing. So now we should see each other, everyone. Great. Well, thanks ever so much, Steve. As you said, very sobering, all of it. So question time. Susan, I can see your hand up. Go ahead.
It's more, not quite a question, but I was just wondering, I read recently that, you know, those pit bull dogs, they were actually bred originally for chasing and capturing runaway slaves in the USA. And I was actually horrified because I was thinking how vicious they are. And, you know, there's a lot of people being killed by them. And I was just thinking, well, that's what they were bred for, to capture slaves. I don't know if anyone else has heard that, but it's more of a point rather than a question. But
well, we could Google it, Susan, and see what they.
It was an article I read an article recently.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, go ahead, unmute.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that the vast majority of the countries that Steve talked about there were all colonized for a couple of hundred years before the 20th century. I I don't imagine chattel slavery and all the rest of the things Steve talked about started with independence. So my assumption is that the colonial powers just turned a blind eye to it. Do you think that's right?
Probably, yes. I mean, Mauritania is a very sparsely populated country, and not one of the countries that France was particularly involved with. There were no minerals there, so it wasn't a country that France was particularly keen to hold on to, like Algeria, Ivory Coast, and Senegal. So it is very sparsely populated. So it was left to get onto its own devices, probably.
Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I wasn't surprised to see Q8 on your list for domestic servitude. I had no idea about it until we'd lived there for a year or two. And it was quite shocking. You know, there were professional families, you know, who we were friends with, who would have a maid from Sri Lanka or Philippines or whatever. And they would lock them in the flat with the children during the day when they went to work. And they would take away their passports. Some even took away their shoes. And this seemed to be the norm, you know, and I should have recognized it as slavery then. I mean, I recognized it as being very wrong, but it was just, it really was the norm. And these were professional, educated people in many cases. Like our neighbour, they were two professional Egyptians. They had a little boy, same age as one of ours. And I knocked on their door one day to ask him to come round to play. And it was the maid who didn't speak any English. And somehow she helped me understand that she couldn't open the door because she was locked in. And so it was shocking.
This seems to be the norm under the kafala system.
I should, I should add to what Karen has said that every piece of the puzzle that created this infrastructure, this system, somehow helped to perpetuate it. And just two examples. One, the reason why our neighbours, for example, were locking up their maid during the day was that the government made you entirely responsible for the behaviour of your servant or maid or helper or whatever. So if your servant or maid or helper went out into the street and misbehaved, then it was entirely on your head. And therefore, to a certain extent, it meant that all the people who could afford servants and maids, they, of course, would speak to each other and say, oh, no, you have to keep them locked up and so on. So they weren't trying to be cruel. They were almost thinking that they were actually being kind. Oh, it's for your own good. So that helped to perpetuate it. But what we also were very much aware of is that in the Pacific Rim, many of these servants came from the Philippines, for example. There were agencies and they had queues and waiting lists of the people who actually wanted to come into these systems, even though they knew exactly what they were letting themselves in for. But in a sense, they had a very difficult choice at their end because they knew that this was an option to earn good money. So in other words, the system did actually pay you quite well. And in most cases, you had very little to spend it on because you weren't allowed out of the house. So actually, you ended up sending perhaps half of it, 3/4 of it, back to your family in the Philippines, for example. So again, the message got out to the Philippines and the agencies that this was actually a very, very good way of earning money. So again, you could see how this this form of servitude was, in a sense, perpetuated, and still is, of course, very much so, by all these parts of the system that are part of exactly the same narrative.
Yours must have been treated much better than some of the other servants.
It was a mixed bag. It was we also knew downstairs, for example, where there was genuine abuse.
Yes.
And that depended entirely, and we saw this again and again, on the individuals, the professionals in many cases, whether they actually were unpleasant people or very kind, pleasant people. So in a sense, that was absolutely down to the individuals what that behavior was going to be like. Yeah. So, Father Claro, take yourself off mute. You're on mute.
I came in UK in 1994. I have hundreds of cases, that I attended of human trafficking and modern slavery here in UK, in London especially. Just last month I had a case. I helped a lady. She was even a Filipino Muslim, who were enslaved by Egyptian bunker. And doctor, his father was a doctor. She was serving the father and the children and getting very small salary, and then the other day, last month as well, a domestic helper, modern slavery by a Saudi couple, but quite well educated, She was even a journalist, a journalist from Saudi. But this is just last month, and they happening here in London, in UK. Last year there was one in Portsmouth. No, in fact she came here for refuge, and we had to send her to London. Anyway, this is happening here in UK. No, hundreds of Filipinos, Sri Lankan, and we have a group in London. There are about 5 groups now who are rescuing them, telling them, that this is UK, there are laws here in UK, and and if they can escape, the people, the charity groups, help them build up their cases. Problem, with Saudi people, the government doesn't like to touch the Saudi people because of the arms trade, and the money they're getting from the Saudi government. It was, I think, we discussed this with Kevin, the commissioner for the anti-slavery. I think he already resigned. Steve, you mentioned about Kevin, the first commissioner for modern anti-slavery.
Kevin
he just
Hyman.
resigned. Who is there now? It was formed by Theresa May. So that's far as we can do, because the government here, even though it's clear by the lawyers, it's anti-human trafficking and slavery, they don't want to touch, especially if they're royal families, Many royal families have Filipino domestic helpers and Sri Lankan and Indian, but they prefer the Filipinos, and they come here and they stay here for a year and they go back to Saudi and so on and so forth, and they treat them as family, but they don't pay them the salary and they keep them in bondage and often an SOP, their passport with them, so that they threaten them. If they escape, they will be caught by the police, and they will be accused of stealing.
Has message got back to the Philippines that some of them are being mistreated?
Sorry?
Has the message got back to the Philippines that some of them are being mistreated?
Yeah. It was a case in the Middle East when the the Filipino government official, were, were, were siding with their employers, who were abusing them, There are hundreds of domestic helpers in the embassy in the Middle East, I think Saudi and other parts, asking for help, but they couldn't help, because they make money out of the agency as well. The agencies pay a lot of money for the government officials to in the payroll. And when this government official are reported, they are not dismissed. They are just sent from one embassy to another, because they are political appointees,
Yes.
Father Claro, have you
Yeah.
had cases in Oxfordshire for cases of modern slavery, like nail bars or car washing?
Yeah. I'm not very much in contact with the nail bars and the car washers, because but in Southampton and Portsmouth, they have car washers there from Albania and so on, they're not paid well. Very minimum wage, and their accommodation are very bad, But they don't physically harm them, They don't physically harm them. Unlike some reports that the travelers, the travelers who this case, they are travelers, they're Catholics as well. The travelers are Catholics, enslaving this Scottish guy, you see them,
Has anyone been in contact with our local car washers and nail bars to see if people are exploited?
Our nail bar here in Faringdon, they are legal and so on, They come to church.
Right.
Dean and so
we know
on.
them, Steve. We know
I
them.
know you know them, but in other places, I'm sure they have the Vietnamese agencies getting them, not only in nail bars, but also, the Vietnamese, many of them were caught in the marijuana. By they're enslaved to plant and produce marijuana in the houses, Well, it's what you call that ventilated and so on, But the poor Vietnamese slaves, they're really slaves, because they're in bondage, the gang, the agency, the gangs, they have contact with the family, And if they make mistake here, the family will be harmed in Vietnam and also in China, I am in contact with the Chinese traffickers or Chinese victims of trafficking by the snakehead. There's still some coming, but in 1999, a lot of them came with the snakehead, paid 20,000 pounds to come here, and they have to work 2 years or even 3 years more if they don't get their papers. So our tactic was to help them get their papers, to be legal here. And when they become legal, they now they own restaurants. And after paying the debt of 3 years, now they're 20 years here. They own restaurants and they live good life now here.
So their debt never decreases.
No, as soon as they get the papers, no. But their Chinese employers are very, very wise. They don't like them to get their papers, They just keep just the other day, the one Chinese coming to me, you know, asking me to. He has been here for 20 years and no papers, and of course he's enslaved in the takeaway. And a friend, because his wife became, he's not a Catholic, but his wife was Catholic in China. I have to make a letter to the Home Office. Hopefully, uh, uh, his his uh, his appeal will be accepted, because he's been deceived by his employer and other friends, you know, that he couldn't get the papers. Sometimes the lawyers are conniving also with the shop owners. You know, there's a problem with the Chinese, you know. Many countries, you know, who are here for a long time, they are countries, you know, and they generally don't like the mainland people, you know, especially in Fujian. Fujian is a very poor province in China. I have been there myself, you know.
Yes.
But anyway, I have a lot of things to say. That's my experience, you know. And there's still slavery here in UK, in London, and many parts of UK.
Thank you, Father Clement.
Thank you.
Jenny, unmute.
Sorry about that. Thanks to Steve for a very comprehensive overview of slavery. I'm sure there's such a lot of information, most of it new to me. But I would like to know whether Steve or other people have come across any campaigns against slavery in this country. I'm sure there must be some group somewhere who are campaigning against it. We have various anti-racist groups, but I haven't heard of any that are specifically anti-slavery, which is, well, it's a form of racism, isn't it?
There's Freedom United.
Jenny, do you remember Reggie Norton?
Indeed, I do, yes.
So he was our last speaker at Faringdon Peace Group, talking about modern day slavery, and that was about 10 years ago. And the reason why we chose him as our speaker is because he was president of the Anti-Slavery Society in London, which is a very active group, in fact, and Father Claro probably knows more about them. But certainly that would be the group that we would focus on supporting, for example, if we felt that it was something that we could kind of leverage. You know, Steve, I thought your final slide was very good, where you said, what can we do about it? And in a sense, you're telling us to be aware of, you know, what we buy and where we go and who we visit and,
exactly.
and so on. And in a way, we are seeing that in operation in London Street, in the nail bar, because, yes, we know those Vietnamese, and we also know that they're incredibly good at cooking. They make delicious food, and we know them all by name. And we know, therefore, that to a certain extent, you know, it's protected against this kind of exploitation because of our awareness and because of this smaller community. But as soon as you get slightly bigger, then clearly it becomes much easier for it to happen under your nose and you not to be aware of it.
True.
The problem is that if you don't buy or get them work, you know, with the nail bars and so on, you're depriving them also of their money, you know. So the best way for me, you know, is really to help them get their papers here so that they can work legally, you know, and earn the basic minimum wage, British law, you know, pay their taxes and pay their NA. What do you call it?
NI.
NI.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? We're running out of time, but we've still got time for one or two more questions. Jenny.
It's not a question, it's a comment. But for the Archers fans amongst us,
yes.
This interestingly enough, one of the long story themes they had, which ended some years ago now, was about slavery. I think where 2 or 3 young men were enslaved, and then the goodies amongst the Archers team had to help publicise this and solve the problem. So I thought it's quite interesting that the Archers has in fact taken up the story.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I should perhaps add, Steve started off with the history of slavery, that it goes way, way beyond the transatlantic slavery. And some of you may know that in the Doomsday Book, 1086, Faringdon is listed. And I'll just read out the households here, the description. 17 villagers and 12 smallholders and 16 slaves. And that's the total population of Faringdon. 17 villagers, 12 smallholders, and 16 slaves. That's the Doomsday Book for you.
Seems to have grown a little since then.
There'd probably be more serfs than slaves, would they?
Yeah, they were described as slaves in the Doomsday Book. Interesting. So obviously it was Old English, Latin. Yeah, and we were the second most significant population centre in the Kingdom of Wessex at the time. Can you work it out? And yet we were so small. So anyway.
Interesting fact.
Yeah.
Can I just one last question to Father Claro, actually. Am I right in thinking that you've also had something to do with workers on ships in Southampton and Portsmouth? Yes.
Yeah.
And
terrible, the workers at the ship, terrible situation. Filipino sailor, not only Filipinos, but the sailors themselves, they're deprived of their liberty, and they're really modern slaves, they're paid very low, and they couldn't get access to the land insurance and so on, And the worst is the fishermen, Filipinos and other race, mostly in Ireland and in Scotland, because they couldn't get their visas only. They have to sleep in the boat, They cannot go to the land, and often, they're abused by the captain, And when the captain, we have cases where the captain got drunk, he abused them, and so on. We had to call the police to intervene, but the police cannot do thing only that they're not in their area, because they're supposed to be at the shore, at the sea. And there's also one who had an accident, and the police couldn't intervene because the ship flag is not British, Although they are owned by British people, but the ship flag is in Caribbean, subject to the labor laws in Caribbean. But the owners are British,
I think there's another case with a ship that's been
Terrible,
abandoned somewhere in Scotland, and the crew are stuck there with no resident status anywhere and no pay.
so are they stuck on the
sobering
ship,
thought.
Are they stuck on the ship, Steve?
I think so, yes.
Right.
I'm also a cruise chaplain, sometimes they ask me to sail with them, and the terrible condition with the workers in the ship,
Yes.
They work until midnight. So I have to say the mass and confession midnight, because they have to work hard, and they're paid the very minimum, not the British wage, and when they get sick and depressed, I have cases where they just jump suicide, the ship, because they don't have affect their mental health as well.
Perhaps of interest to you that for about 20 years, from 1990 to 2010, the Catholic Church in Faringdon, we were supporting a project under Bonded Labour Liberation Front in Pakistan, focusing on bricklayers, and we would send them approximately £3,000 a year for as part of this support. And the key to liberation, if you like, taking people out of bonded labour, was education of the children, because otherwise they also would be locked in almost in perpetuity in that bonded labour situation. If they stayed uneducated, then they were guaranteed to just follow their parents into that bricklaying work, if you like. But if you could, brick making, I should have said. Whereas if the children could be educated, then clearly they would, through their own resources, be able to actually break out of that vicious cycle and find ways of earning a living that made more, and which meant that they were no longer reliant on this infrastructure, which was all that they knew. So, and that was very effective. But yeah, one case at a time almost.
Yes, India has a space program, but yet it doesn't give all their children an education still.
Yeah.
Which is very disappointing.
Yeah.
We've reached past 9 o'clock, and we always feel that it's unfair to kind of abuse our speaker for any longer than 9 o'clock. So, Steve, thanks ever so much. It's been incredibly powerful and information-rich presentation from you, and really appreciated. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Can I just abuse the space for about 10 seconds longer?
Yeah, go for it, Dave.
I just wanted to give a plug. At TFON, we produced a little video around Remembrance Sunday, which just gives some of the sort of statistics around spending on conflict and armed conflict and things. I'll post it in the chat for anyone that wants to have a look at it. It's only 3 minutes long. It's a bit clunky because it's homemade by me, but so it's not quite as polished as usual TFON stuff. But
extremely good, David.
Please do have a look at it. Yeah,
well worth that.
Use it and share it as wildly as you can. It's in the chat now. For anyone who can get it.
Great, well done. So thanks, Dave. Sometimes when you close the session, then the chat suddenly all disappears. So it's quite important that you click on that hyperlink in the chat now, so that you don't lose that hyperlink.
Where is it?
You need to open your chat, Jenny.
Yeah,
along the bottom, one of the options is chat. If you click along the bottom bar, then one of the options is chat. And if you click that, then you can see that there's quite a lot in there at the moment with other hyperlinks as well.
Father Claro as well.
Yeah, so Father Claro has also given us a link to a Facebook page. I'll see if I can save it in the recording. But anyway, everyone, thanks very much indeed for attending, and we'll close the session now.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
So have you saved it?
That didn't work, did it?
Are you still trying to open the chat, Jenny?
Yes, I did have it open. Now it's gone again.
Right, you just need to. Yeah, these buttons tend to move around a bit, I'm afraid.
They do indeed. They come up with something I don't want.
Dave, we need to click on your link as well, so before we lose it.
Yeah, I can email it to anybody as well if
yeah, that would be useful. Braithwaite braces would be useful. Right, we've saved it there. Right, I am going to switch off recording